great talk here today in Abilene. Talk about sort of almost where you left off. Let's start at the end almost, where you were talking about the fact that there's just sort of a different feel right now in the way the government is interacting with employers, right? I mean, that you have a lot of things being done on the regulatory side, whereas they might otherwise be done on the side of legislation, right?
Yes, and I don't want to sound political because,
sure.
I have clients that are Democrats and Republicans, sure. and everyone's entitled to their opinion. I do think that with the level of congressional gridlock that we have, everyone has an agenda in the White House. The Obama administration has an agenda. All other administrations have one. And in this case, they're not going to get much through Congress. So, in my view, in the employment law world, you're seeing regulatory initiatives. So, for example, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, they regulate federal contractors and they want to see action on employment of disabled workers.
Right.
And they've actually proposed a quota, a 7% quota for federal contractors to hire disabled individuals. That has not been implemented yet, and it's unclear whether they could even enforce an actual quota or if it's just aspirational, but it's an example of something that's coming up through an agency.
So right after the stimulus was passed, there was more in the way of resources for these agencies to go after employers, and now, as you mentioned, it still seems to be a little bit different feel than it was under the last administration, but maybe they're having to do more with less, just like everybody else?
They are having to do more with less, but they are still active. For example, I guess it was just this past week that Thomas Perez was officially confirmed by the Senate as the new Secretary of Labor, and he was very candid in his first blog post that he is going to focus on wage and hour enforcement and hopes to raise the minimum wage to $9 an hour and then index it to inflation. And now that's something that would have to be done through Congress, and we'll see. But I think the agencies are not shy, and even though right now, especially with the sequester, they're doing more with less,
right.
but that's not keeping them quiet.
Right, and there's who knows when that'll be over, because we have gridlock, but at the same time, things change, and there's an election next year, right? So we have that going on, and then you also mentioned something that I thought would be very interesting for our construction audience, a construction citizen, which is you talked about the story of, and this has to do with some of the things that happen under harassment law, the story of the guy who was the world-class trash talker. Yes. Talk about that. What happened in that case?
Well, that was Bow Brothers Construction, and this isn't a secret. It's a reported Fifth Circuit case from 2012. And that particular case, it was a construction site. Obviously, I don't know what happened, but the court opinions indicate that it was somewhat of a rogue supervisor who was calling certain workers princess or faggot and being really visual, too. I mean, if someone was bent over, he might come up behind them and gesticulate and that sort of thing. My message to the audience was just, even though the Fifth Circuit took away a large jury verdict, it was actually about $450,000, the Fifth Circuit took it away and said, well, this is not sexual harassment and we're not going to police a construction site.
Yeah.
The employer loses either way.
Right.
That's a very expensive lawsuit that dragged on for years. And
right, by the time they got there, you made note of this, that it was, what, about $500,000 in attorney's fees, when it could have gone back to the beginning of the whole thing and just said, calm down out there on the site, right?
Exactly. And again, I've been on construction sites, and
right.
Hard hats are not my look, but I've been out there and I know how difficult it is. Certain sites, for whatever reason, I had one circumstance where the issue was graffiti in the porta potties. There were certain unpopular welders in that case, and they could not control that very personal defamatory graffiti was going up in the porta potties, and management would come in and erase it every day, and it would pop up the next day. And we really struggled with that work site to where, people couldn't have paint pens, and it sounds ridiculous, but in that case, at least management was responding when these workers complained, and hopefully that avoided a lawsuit. In
the area of employment law, it has to be really difficult to keep employers up to date on what's happening. That's why these conferences are really great. I know that you spoke at one in the Woodlands where there was about 1,000 people, and here we are in Abilene. It was a smaller group, but still a lot of people very interested in finding out what's going on. You have an hour to speak at a deal like this, and you get toward the end, and you're at the end of an hour, and you still have a whole lot of things you would like to say, right? And a lot of it just has to do with the fact that there is so much to this. And some of it is, so much is constantly changing, right? I mean, it's really hard to keep up with.
It is hard to keep up with, and my favorite clients are the ones that I work with on a regular basis, and I'm not telling them what to do. It's very collaborative. So
Right.
I may have an HR director, or in some cases a business owner, that I just need them to be able to spot the issue.
Right.
And then they can call me and we can brainstorm, and we may need to bring in other assistants, maybe an investigator, depending on the circumstance. It takes a meeting of the minds, I think, to do this properly in this environment.
All right, and that's one reason we appreciate you going to be writing for us at Construction Citizen.
I'm excited about that. Yes.
Vianei, thank you.
Thank you. Scott?